My name is Effie, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on refugees as a vulnerable population in healthcare. I just want to start this presentation by explaining why I chose refugees as my population to talk about. The first being that my grandmother was actually a refugee from Syria. Her and her 6 siblings and parents came over from Syria, fleeing from the war, and she was born on Ellis Island, which is pretty cool. Another reason is because I spent my first semester at UNE working at the Boys and Girls Club in Riverton. And Riverton is a neighborhood that primarily houses refugees from Somalia and West Sudan. I really love my time there, and I really think there's a lot to be said about how we as nurses can work to look as a patient, as a whole person, and figure out ways to give them more culturally competent care. So, with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so who are refugees? Refugees are people that are forced to flee their own country and seek safety. They're unable to return to their country because of feared persecution. This can be because of who they are or what they believe in, or it can be because of armed conflict and violence. Why do refugees matter to us here in Maine? There's a lot of reasons. While in 2022, only 3.8% of Maine's population was foreign born, 37% of that foreign born population lived in Cumberland County, which is where we are today. And this number is only increasing. So, Maine State officials expect that 840 refugees will arrive in Maine in 2024. And the main place that they come is Portland. This is really illustrated quite well in this diagram, which you can see that Portland houses a good amount of people in the Cumberland area. So, they're very relevant to our care here. Okay, why are refugees defined as oppressed or marginalized? From a healthcare perspective, refugee enters the United States and they immediately face many barriers to healthcare. These barriers include challenges navigating the U.S. healthcare system, limited English proficiency, barriers to finding culturally and linguistically appropriate healthcare, availability of social and community support systems, and the overall cost of healthcare. Now, how do these barriers affect their care and their overall well-being? For this, I'm going to look at social determinants of health. I spent a semester in South Africa studying public health, and this was the first time I had learned about social determinants of health, and I think it's a really great way that we can look at patients from a holistic perspective and really see them not only for maybe what their clinical manifestations are, but see how their lifestyle and struggles that they're experiencing can affect their health. So, social determinants of health are the conditions and the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health functioning and quality of life outcomes and risks. And social determinants of health can be broken down into many categories. These 5 categories I'm going to be talking about a little more in depth next. So, starting with economic stability. Refugees often don't have great economic stability. This is in part due to the fact that they're placed receiving entry-level or low-income jobs when they first come to the United States. A lot of this has to do with their language proficiency or their educational status. Without really being able to speak English well, this really prohibits many people from getting higher up or higher paying jobs because, unfortunately, in America, if you can't speak English, it's really challenging. We should also look at economic stability from an environmental standpoint. If you don't bring in an adequate income, you are likely not able to buy healthy, nutritious food or live in an adequate house, which brings us to our next point. neighborhood, and environment. So many of these refugees are placed in subsidized housing or low income neighborhoods when they first come to the United States. And it's generally seen that in these neighborhoods, there are higher crime areas. I know when I was working at the Boys and Girls Club, little kids came in every day crying because a bike was stolen, which was really heartbreaking. But it's really just the environment that, unfortunately, some of these families are living in. Um, and with higher crime comes higher stress, which can have negative health impacts, which I will get into in a little bit later in the presentation. It's also important to note that in Portland, we're really running out of places for refugees to be housed. It was noted that in May, 1,200 asylum seekers were currently being housed in Portland, and there's not really many places to continue to house them as our refugee population continues to grow. There were two interesting articles that I found about this. One from NPR, which kind of focuses on Portland, but also the surrounding rural areas. As refugees aren't able to fit in Portland, how they're starting to come to the surrounding areas in Portland and how the cities are adapting to that. And then this one was actually 4 days ago, in late March. There were 64 asylum seekers that had to be relocated because of a cockroach infestation from where they were currently living. I think this is a really good way to point out, if you have a cockroach infestation where you're living, what other conditions are you probably living in? One that really I think of is mold. I'm sure there's mold in this place, and that really has negative outcomes. Cockroaches surely aren't great for your health, aren't great for your health either. So it's important. I think this is important, an example of really the environment that these people live in and how that can impact overall health outcomes. A few other ways we can look at this is from an educational standpoint. 71% of Maine's refugees don't have a bachelor's degree, which limits their jobs. And then also with education comes health literacy. I think the healthcare system and understanding the body is something that many, many people struggle with. But if you don't speak the language and you don't maybe have a very high educational level, it can be more challenging to understand your healthcare and really what it means to live a healthy lifestyle. Which brings us to our next point of healthcare access and quality. So while refugees should be given Medicaid, it can take up to 8 months after their arrival to the United States before this Medicaid is fully active. So what are these patients doing in the 8 months that they don't have health services? What if it takes longer? Do they even know that Medicaid is something they can provide, they can get for themselves? And health insurance isn't an easy thing to go through. Are they equipped to be able to enroll in these services, and do they know about them? Another thing that I bring up is limited in-person interpreters. During some of my clinicals, I worked with a refugee who spoke no English and used an iPad interpreter for the majority of his stay. And one thing I really noted was the lack of humanity that can often be found in iPad translators. While, of course, a translator, regardless of who and how we get it, is better than no translator. But he seemed very frustrated with the use of the iPad and having to get it set up, and often kind of shook his head when we started to set up the iPad. And the nurses and other healthcare staff that I witnessed kind of just let this happen. And I don't really think this is acceptable. Patients have a right to receive healthcare in their own language, and we should be looking for ways to improve this and finding healthcare that really looks at humanity and provides, translators that everyone can kind of agree with and be on the same page with. And then finally, we can look at refugees from a social and community standpoint. So there's a lot of politics out there that refugees are taking American jobs. This negative viewpoint can really be quite discriminatory to refugees. We can also look at this from a racial discrimination perspective. And when you have discrimination, you generally have poor mental health and overall higher stress levels. And I found this pretty interesting study that looked at discrimination and its impacts on physiological health. And they found that when you have discrimination, it can often cause acute and chronic stressors, which can raise your blood pressure and your heart rate and cortisol secretion, which leads to mental and physical decline. And I think this is really important when we think about, the stress system with cortisol and epinephrine and your sympathetic nervous system. This impacts you greatly. If you have cortisol always pumping through your system, you're going to have an increased glucose level. So it makes sense that they might have higher morbidities like diabetes and hypertension with those stress hormones elevated all the time. One study I found that I thought was pretty interesting looked at Somalia Somalian refugees. Let's see, right here. And Somalian refugees are one of the larger groups that we have in Portland. And they found that Somalian, as compared to other American descent, are more likely to have obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and hyperlipidemia. So I think it's important to look at these stressors as a way that can impact physiological health, but also when we're seeing clients day to day, we need to keep these morbidities in mind to provide the best care that we can. So, what can we do to help this population? There are actually quite a bit of resources. It's just a matter of making sure that refugees know about these resources. Some that I've listed are the Office of Refugee Resettlement Program, the Catholic Charities of Maine, which does really a ton of work in all areas for refugees. They help house them. They help them find employment. They also help, on the other end, help businesses who want to hire refugees kind of sort through that process and look at what a refugee may need. They also offer mentoring services and legal services. For our current healthcare resources, we have Medicaid, of course, but I've mentioned some of the barriers to Medicaid, and in-hospital translators. iPads are a source for now, but I think we often should take a step back and make sure that we're really connecting with the patient on a compassionate level while we're using iPads. Okay, so how can nurses be an advocate for refugees? I think we can look at this through an ethical standpoint, a legal standpoint, and then a political standpoint. So for ethical considerations, as nurses, it's super important that we look at patient rights. For instance, patients have a right to receive healthcare in their first language. So it should be really important that we aren't just slacking and taking blood pressure and saying good, no, but actually using the translator whenever we can to make sure that they're fully understanding their care and that they can ask questions whenever they need to. We also need to ensure that they have culturally competent care. One example I think of is these patients often have completely different diets than the standard Americanized diet. So how are we adapting so that they can have the food that they want or that they're used to while they're in the hospitals? And also, are we offering dietitians that understand their perspective of food and how can we adapt services so that they can receive that culturally competent care? For legal considerations, of course, patient rights are really important from a legal standpoint, but also we need to ensure that patients understand that they have a right to Medicaid, and and that Maine care can be provided for pregnant women and for children. So do they know about these services and have they signed up for them? And then finally, political considerations. So there is a ton of organizations that nurses can join. These that I've listed all have community health workers, which you can join to help improve health literacy in refugees. And they also offer family assistance, mentoring, youth programs, and overall are just great resources if nurses want to be advocates for this group and get involved. So that is all I have for you. And there's a lot more we could discuss.